Today we're going to look at another heavily requested B1M video. Specifically, Finland might have solved nuclear power's biggest problem. So they found a bunch of investors for us. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tyler Folse. I'm a nuclear engineer with a little over 10 years of experience in the commercial nuclear power industry. From engineering to operations to emergency response. I don't claim to know everything there is nuclear, but I can certainly share some knowledge. Let's check this out.
It's an immense project. Since 2005, Finland's been constructing the largest nuclear reactor in Europe, alongside a facility that could solve the problem of what to do with spent nuclear fuel.
Now that's wonderful. New nuclear power plant as well as a new spent fuel repository at the same time. That's a good example of long-term thinking.
When you think nuclear, the Nordic nation doesn't immediately jump to mind, but if all of its planned projects come to fruition, then by the end of the decade, the country will be second only to France in terms of the percentage of energy drawn from nuclear systems. After more than a decade of delays and cost overruns, 2022 will see the world's happiest country switch on one of the planet's most advanced reactors.
So this video's a few years old, and they're referring to newer nuclear power plant in Finland. That's Olkiluoto Unit 3. Please feel free to correct me on my pronunciation. I don't claim to know Finnish. But yes, that plant did start producing power in 2022. They've had a few issues, some secondary systems such as the impellers and their feed water pumps. They've also had a foreign material exclusion issue, or FME issue, in the secondary system as well. But as of 2023, they are producing power. But yes, this reactor is an EPR, which used to be called a European pressurized reactor, but it's a bit ironic because the first ones came online in China. So I've also heard the term evolutionary power reactor, which is interesting. But yeah, they're a more modern pressurized water reactor than the Westinghouse 4-loop that I worked at. Similar technology types to the AP1000 reactors that were just built in Georgia and are now supplying power. So really, really cool stuff.
Potentially kickstarting a new age of nuclear power.
That would be awesome.
Finland actually has a long history with nuclear power. Its first reactor came online in 1977, and by 1980, 3 more were operational, providing a third of Finland's total energy needs. While these reactors are among the most efficient in the world, running at...
I know Finland's a smaller country compared to, say, the US, Russia, or France in terms of how much energy they produce and consume, but this is still really impressive for a relatively small country to use this much nuclear power. It really is cool to see.
It's a 95% capacity factor for the past decade and continually being uprated over their life cycle. Growing demand...
Capacity factor is one of the more important key performance indicators when you look at generation of any power plant. And nuclear power plants' capacity factor is very high, usually well over 95%. Really what capacity factor is actual power output divided by your theoretical maximum power output over some period of time. And nuclear power plants, their goal is to go up to 100% and stay there for 18 to 24 months at 100% power. They typically don't operate load following like renewables, for instance. You take them up to 100% and you keep it there. And they're designed to do this. They're designed to keep going. There's no variability like there is with wind and solar. It's one of the biggest advantages of nuclear power.
And the seasonal fluctuations of other renewable sources like hydro and solar has left the country relying on imports from Russia and Sweden to make up the balance of its energy needs. To lessen its reliance on foreign energy and help meet its goal of carbon neutrality by 2035, the Finnish government approved the construction of what was meant to be the world's first third-generation pressurized water reactor, or ERP, at its Olkiluoto nuclear plant, known as...
He mentions third generation. So generation 1 was ones that were built in the 50s and 60s. Were not terribly efficient and were more of a proof of concept sort of thing. I mean, yes, they did generate power and supply it to the grid, but It was really more of a proof of concept rather than a big scale. I mean, it didn't last very long. It only lasted 10, 20 years. Now, Generation 2 were a lot more efficient, a lot safer, typically having redundant systems. And the plant I worked at was kind of an extreme example. It was one of the later Generation 2 plants. It was built in the late 80s, early 90s. One of its features was it had 3 trains of safety systems, and one of those trains by itself could safely shut down the nuclear plant and protect everything. But we had 3, just to be sure. And that's not counting additional safety systems that were brought in and ones that were stored remotely that were incorporated after the Fukushima event. This is a level beyond that. So the EBR and the AP1000, they rely on a lot more passive systems, such as gravity. A lot of emergency cooling systems are simply driven by systems like gravity and natural circulation. Now, those do exist in some Generation 2 plants as well, but just not as much. The nice thing about relying on passive systems is you lose power, like in Fukushima, nothing bad happens. What was interesting is at the plant I work at, if one of your safety systems, a component becomes inoperable, say one of the emergency core cooling pumps becomes inoperable, you enter what is known as a limiting condition for operation, which means you have to shut down the reactor within a certain time period, usually something like 7 days, or get the system fixed. And you typically get the system fixed well before 7 days. But in a system that relies mainly on passive systems, those timelines are greatly extended, meaning that maintenance is even less disruptive to plant operations, at least as far as mechanical work. Now, since these are a lot more modern designs and a lot of it involves control systems, a lot more maintenance in these Generation 3 reactors are going to be to do with control systems and computer systems more so than mechanical or electrical systems, at least compared to the previous generation.
OL3 in 2005. With an initial cost of $3.9 billion, OL3 was to nearly double the plant's existing output and provide 14% of Finland's energy needs when it became operational by 2010.
That's the other thing. These EPRs are a lot bigger than those older PWRs.
But while OL3 was the first EPR to begin construction ahead of other next-generation reactors in France, China and the UK, complexities surrounding the design, defects in safety systems and contractual disputes led to over a decade of delays, and in 2018...
That's the problem when doing anything new, and it's something that has to be customized to each site, like building a new facility. That's the same issues that the plants in Georgia, that those new plants in the US, that those new reactors in the US ran into. And yeah, it turned out that China beat them to it as far as connecting it to the grid.
China's Taishan 1 became the first EPR reactor in the world to start operating. Despite these delays and the cost swelling to over $10.2 billion, OL3 was granted an operation license by Finland's Radiation and Nuclear Safety Authority in 2019.
Look at these control rooms. They're all like there's a whole bunch of computerized systems pulled up, big screens. I can't show you pictures of the control room that I worked at, but it was a lot more reliance on the board indications, and the computers looked like they were from the late 90s, early 2000s. And it even had those old school orange plasma screens that you see in movies like The China Syndrome.
And in March 2021, 116 tons of uranium began to be loaded into the reactor ahead of its final testing phase. Once it's connected to the grid and the reactor begins commercial production in early 2022, the countdown will be on until OL3 begins adding to Finland's spent fuel stockpile.
And I can say this, watching this video years later, this absolutely happened, and it's wonderful.
Nuclear power is an incredibly clean way to produce energy, but it does create a byproduct, and it's the one problem we've yet to truly solve.
I'm going to challenge that, in that it kind of depends what you mean by solve. So the way nuclear waste is processed, I'm going to talk mainly about high-level waste because I'm pretty sure that's what he's talking about. By the way, if you want to hear me talk more about low and intermediate level waste. I'll pin that video in a comment down below. This goes over a really good bad example of how not to do it, and I talk about both. So if you want to hear about low and intermediate, check that out. But high-level waste is simply the spent fuel, and it is stored in the spent fuel pool for about 10 to 20 years, usually 20 years, and then it is brought out into dry cask storage, and it can sit in these containers for decades. Yes, it is safe to walk right next to it. You can even bear hug these casks. They are spent fuel encased in over 150 tons of reinforced concrete. Encased in reinforced concrete, it weighs 150 tons and can withstand severe weather and even direct missile strikes. And they can stay just outside on a pad. At the plant I worked at, the pad was licensed through 2100. And not to say that anything bad happens in 2100, you can always get your license extended. And what that looks like is an engineering evaluation and a regulatory review process. It's pretty rigorous, though for this, I wouldn't think it would be as rigorous as, say, a license extension on a nuclear power plant, simply because there's not really any moving parts at work here. But it would still be quite the rigorous process, because this is high-level nuclear waste that we are talking about. But it's essentially there. They can be stored on-site, and at all the nuclear power plants, at least the ones in the US, there's enough area to store it on site to accommodate the lifespan of the nuclear power plant. And if the nuclear power plant's license can be extended, at least at the plant I worked at, there was plenty of room for a whole bunch more casks to be loaded there. But I get what he means. After all, decades to centuries is not a permanent solution, but I'm just saying it's not nearly as big of a problem as people make it out to be.
After 3 to 6 years, irradiated material is no longer able to sustain a reaction as a viable fuel source.
3 to 6 years. So that depends on your fuel loading and the individual core design. At the plant I worked at, it lasted about 3 cycles. You'd have fresh fuel, then your first burn, and your second burn, nuclear fuel that you put back in for another cycle. So yeah, towards the upper end of that, in the 4.5 to 6 year range, though that depends a lot on your loading panel. It's possible to burn through stuff in less than 3 years if you load it that way, but that's not exactly the most efficient way to use your nuclear fuel. And for an EPR, it's going to be towards the upper end of that, 24 months at least.
And new material must be brought in to maintain the reactor's efficiency. But while it's unable to generate electricity, spent fuel remains highly radioactive and needs to be isolated for hundreds of thousands of years.
What's interesting is because of, no, it doesn't generate electricity, but you could take one of those dry casks and you said hundreds of thousands of years. You could heat your hot tub for hundreds of thousands of years if the regulator allowed you to do it, but you can hook up a couple of pipes there. Nah. And the only reason why I say no is just because the regulatory cost would be too much. I don't want the Nuclear Regulatory Commission at my house.
To prevent it causing harm to people or the surrounding environment. Although spent fuel can be re-enriched and re-enter the fuel cycle, the main way we currently deal with radioactive waste is to simply store it in pools.
So that's a very important point. If we put some of it back into that fuel cycle, or at least more than what we actually do, especially within the US, you could essentially extend it and make us have to mine less. And mining is just probably one of the dirtiest aspects of the nuclear fuel cycle, just because mining anything is not exactly the safest job in the world, whether you're mining gold or uranium or silver or coal. Though I will say, mining uranium, even though it is radioactive and radon gas does come from natural uranium and thorium deposits, mining uranium is actually safer than mining coal if you just look at the per energy density basis, meaning that you have to mine a lot more coal in order to get the same amount of power as mining uranium. One uranium fuel pellet, which is about the size of a pistachio, generates more energy than one ton of coal.
Or sealed dry storage facilities while it slowly decays. While these methods keep spent fuel contained, it's not a viable long-term solution, as the system is heavily reliant on mechanical and human intervention, and even under the strictest conditions, it can be vulnerable to attacks of terrorism or natural disasters.
Spent fuel pools, sure. They're definitely under. Spent fuel pools are, but dry cask, not really. I mean, good luck getting through all that reinforced concrete. They are heavily monitored. That is a regulatory requirement whenever you have nuclear materials. So long after a nuclear power plant is shut down, those dry casks do still have to be monitored. And the spent fuel pool is a lot more vulnerable compared to, say, dry cask, even if it was cooled entirely passively. I will say the spent fuel pool at the plant that I worked at did require pumps, so we just had backup systems for our backup systems for our backup systems, some of which being remote to, again, avoid the Fukushima type event of all of your safety systems destroyed or disabled in one fell swoop due to loss of power. When I say it's more vulnerable in spent fuel pools, the likelihood is still very low of a security incident.
The kind that led to the events at Fukushima in 2011. With an estimated 250,000 tonnes of high-level waste already in storage around the world, and with no long-term strategy of dealing with it, many countries have chosen to completely rule out nuclear power when it comes to meeting their growing energy needs.
Looking at this map here, that's actually not that many, but a lot of these are countries that would definitely see the benefits of nuclear power. It's really sad to see any of these red and yellow dots on there.
In an attempt to solve this, since 2005, Posiva, a joint venture between Finland's two nuclear power providers, has been constructing the world's first deep geological repository for spent fuel in the billion-year-old bedrock not far from OL3.
So this is a lot deeper than, say, salt mines, and has been surveyed to last on the order of hundreds of thousands of years, which is remarkable that we're starting to think that far ahead as a species.
Funded by charges collected from consumers through electricity sales, the $1 billion project that's due to complete in 2023 will see a series of tunnels extend half a kilometre below ground, creating a permanent disposal facility for spent fuel. Now, while burying nuclear waste might sound alarming,
yes, some salt mines are that deep, but this is purpose-driven specifically for nuclear fuel. It's not an aspect of retrofitting anything else. So yes, this is indeed the first in that regard, which is cool.
And may cause concern to environmental groups, the process at Onkalo is so much more than simply burying the problem. Based on a Swedish disposal method known as KBS3, irradiated material is placed into boron steel canisters and enclosed within corrosion-resistant copper capsules before being buried in individual holes and backfilled with bentonite clay.
So a lot of that processing is similar to how it is processed into dry cask storage, so that part isn't different. We're just putting it into a different location. And this is thinner. Now, granted, if you put it this far underground, you have the earth to shield, so no need to invest in these 150-ton concrete canisters. So you're kind of trade-offing costs here, but this one, eventually you'll realize economies of scale, rather than essentially the same cost of dry casks, rather than just the same canisters and dry cask over and over. I mean, when I say dry cask, I'm talking about ones on the surface in that picture I showed earlier, because this is a form of dry cask storage. You're just putting it underground. So I guess you wouldn't need as much shielding. And the boron is an additional layer of subcriticality, because boron-10 absorbs neutrons. Not that the chance of a criticality event basically causing fissions and turning one of these into a reactor is, I might as well say it's impossible. But when I say subcriticality, I'm talking about being even further away from this reaction happening. Just think of it as additional margin. Like 30-degree water is further away from boiling than 40-degree water, for instance. So that is what the boron is for.
Entombing it forever. Once buried, no further mechanical or human intervention is required to contain the radioactive payload, essentially eliminating one of the biggest barriers many countries have when it comes to adopting nuclear power.
I mean, this is going to be expensive at first, and good luck getting everything, but once it's there, essentially your cost is zero, is that you're not going to have to pay essentially operators or reactor or radiation protection technicians to continue to monitor the area. So this will have at least enough of a solution that all humans can vanish and nothing will happen.
With the capacity to accommodate the last 50 years' worth of Finland's accumulated spent fuel, and the needs of its existing reactors until at least 2120, at which time the facility will be permanently sealed, Onkalo appears to provide a viable long-term solution to dealing with nuclear waste. Described as a game-changer for the industry by the director of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the lessons learned at Onkalo are being shared with other countries, and regions with suitable geological characteristics are being considered for similar disposal sites.
This would
Having
be cool.
seemingly solved the biggest drawback of nuclear power, and with a 6th reactor already planned to begin construction next.
So I disagree that the waste is the biggest drawback of nuclear power. I mean, I get what he's saying in that technically that here you're thinking so far into the future, but the biggest drawback is just not being able to find investors to put money in these projects because they just take long to build, so they're going to demand higher rates of return, which leads to a higher discount rate, and they just won't see the benefits. It's just too much of a risk because a lot of things can happen in the 10, 20 years it takes to build some of those. But now, I do not want to dismiss this. This is really cool, but the way to get around this, though I do see that this can actually help with that, just seeing in that it's more supportive of nuclear power. Though I will say anything you can do to get people to support nuclear power will help with that issue. So this is really, really cool.
Year, Finland looks set to play a leading role in the widespread adoption of nuclear technology as the world continues to transition away from fossil fuels. This video was powered by Away from Fossil Fuels.
And that's one thing about nuclear power in general is they can take up the mantle by providing base load. Wind and solar simply can't do that. They're too intermittent. So there's that environmental component. The idea of a long-term solution is great. This would by far, nuclear already is, even the dry cask storage we have now is more of a long-term solution compared to wind turbines and solar panels. Because wind turbines and solar panels have to be replaced every 25 years at best. Best case scenario. There's some that last less than 10 years. Compared that to nuclear power plants, that each individual facility has an initial license of 40 years, which can be extended, and the dry cask pads have an initial license of 80 to 100 years, which can be extended. And now looking at something like this, that can essentially give you peace of mind for hundreds of millennia, that's really cool. Thanks so much for the recommendation, and thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.